Welcome back to another episode of Give the People What They Want. We're joined by Indian journalist Prasanth, as well as international editor for Morningstar Roger McKenzie, and I'm Zoe Alexandra of People's Dispatch. We're bringing you all the stories that you need to know, what's happening in the world on a geopolitical level, what the movements across the world are doing, what are they up to, how are they continuing to fight for change against all odds. So stay tuned.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup.
Well, with many things going on in the world at the moment, it's sometimes hard to remember these processes of deep historical injustices and the arduous and very necessary process of memory, of reparations, and of justice. Right now, Roger, I understand that there's a process underway at the UN in that vein. Tell us a little about what's happening this week.
Yeah, thanks, Zoe. So it's the United Nations Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. They're really good at coming up with these phrases and really good at creating another decade of remembrance. But there's very little actually happens at the end of this. In fact, from January was the African Union, what do they call it? The African Union Year of Justice for Africans and people of African descent. So they're great at all this stuff, but in the end, nothing really happens. Back in 2001, I remember being in Durban at the World Conference Against Racism, and one of the big things that took place there was this whole thing about reparations, and the British tried to scupper the conference, and the US even stormed out of the conference, as I recall. But nothing's really happened. There's very few nations, if any, none spring to mind, that have actually even apologized for the enslavement of other human beings. And that's really the kind of starting point. What we saw this week at the UN was one of the first times that descendants of slave owners, so people like former Prime Minister of Britain, Gladstone, his descendants were there sitting around the table with the descendants of enslaved people. To be honest, I don't know if I could have sat around a table with these folks and made nice polite conversation over a cup of tea or coffee or something, but that's what they did. But still, no apology from the people who could make a difference, and no real difference. So the question really is, what needs to be done to press ahead with moving towards some real, genuine reparations for the enslavement that took place actually not so very long ago. And actually not so very long ago, we actually stopped in Britain paying for the money that was given to the slave owners. So back in 2015, so 10 years ago, I paid money towards the freedom of my descendants, and actually I suppose my own freedom, because without that I'd still be an enslaved person as well. So the question is, what are we going to do to move things forward? What are the movements going to do? One of the things that I think is really important is that we do still continue to work hard to get apologies from nations, but also be really clear that these people who are still benefiting from the proceeds of enslavement are made to pay. And that it shouldn't be something that's foisted on working class people across the globe, and they're being told that you have to pay the money towards this, because that's inevitably what the rich will try and do. So we have to do that. But another thing I think we need to do, Zoe, is to make sure that this is linked to a wider conversation around debt. And the return of the stolen artifacts from Africa and elsewhere as well. And I think that's a really important part of this conversation that gets left out. So it's been completely left out, as far as I can see, from the discussions that have been taking place at the UN. But I think part of what the movements, social movements across the globe need to do is to work hard to make sure that we insert those conversations with a dose of reality, and that is that we need apology, we need reparations, and we need to have the stolen artifacts returned to the people who should rightly have them.
Well, very pertinent given that last week was the anniversary of the 200 years of when France made Haiti pay a ridiculous debt, similar debt for, simply having fought for their freedom and ended enslavement in the first Black Republic in the Americas. So these historical debts and these historical, trajectories continue to shape the world today. That's shapes much of how the global South has continued to be, pushed into subservience by the global North nations. Similarly, broad scale, important pushes towards justice, accountability. Prasanth, what's happening with this antitrust case?
Right. Actually, it's a series of antitrust cases in the United States that's have been taking place over the past few months. Sorry, some major results in the past week. And in fact, there's a similar case in India. I'll come to that towards the end. But what has happened is that two of the biggest tech companies in the world today, that's Meta, that's formerly Facebook, and Google, in the dock for what are called monopolistic practices. And by monopolistic practices, what you mean are basically ways in which they shut out competitors, made sure that they were the only players in the market. And this had a huge effect in so many ways in our world today. So on the one hand, it might look like something that's a bit technical, but whether the Monopolies Act has been violated, whether antitrust laws have been violated, but the actual impact of that is much bigger, and I'll explain how. Because in the case of Google, for instance, it has been concluded that through a variety of ways, they used ways to basically dominate the ad technology. There are two aspects of the ad technology which they made complete dominance on, and that is as a result of that, they were actually able to sort of establish a monopoly over there. Facebook's verdict, of course, has not come out, but what it's being accused of is a very similar attempt at monopoly building by purchasing Instagram and WhatsApp. Now, this happened about 10 years ago, but basically by purchasing Instagram and WhatsApp, Facebook, which is now called Meta, emerged as a behemoth that it is today. And what this enabled a company like Facebook to do is basically, become a part of our lives in every way possible. And Mark Zuckerberg himself is on record saying that in one of his notes that it's better to buy out than compete. And that his aim at that time itself, so many 10 and 15 years ago, was to actually establish a kind of monopoly by buying out these kind of competitors so that the company would become too big and no new competitors could emerge. Now, the question is, what happens if a new competitor does not emerge? And I think that's the important question for people, for activists, for common citizens alike, which is that these kind of tech companies then acquire the impunity to not only change your user experiences or how your Facebook feed looks or how your Google search is, but to actually affect every aspect of life. And we've seen multiple examples of that. We've seen the kind of impact that Facebook has had with something like the Edward Snowden leaks, the kind of the kind of role it was playing. We've seen the Cambridge Analytica scandal. We've seen its role in a country like Myanmar. We've heard whistleblower after whistleblower talk about how it is influencing young children in such negative ways. We've seen its impact on democracy. Now, all of this together continues to this day. So a company like Facebook, which started out as a supposed site where you could connect to your friends, now has such a huge impact on democracies, on people's rights, on people's voting preferences, on every aspect of life across the world. And the scary thing is we don't even know how that happens. The same thing with Google, right? So that is why monopolies are bad. And that is why actually a very powerful movement has been building around the world against these monopolies. It's not just about the money these companies make. That's a huge aspect. They use this money directly to influence policy. But it's also that with these monopolies, they're able to enter every aspect of life. So we'll see how the case against Facebook turns, what happens in the coming weeks as well. Very interesting case. Facebook trying to claim that, we are not really a monopoly player. It's a big market. We have only a small share, whereas I think everyone knows the kind of impact Facebook had. It's been chronicled quite a bit. The excesses of people like Mark Zuckerberg who really want to reshape the world in according to their thoughts, and for whom, who are willing to spend millions to push a bit any aspect of their agenda, which are without even really thinking as to whether the people need it, whether it's good for the people, etc. So there are a lot of examples of that, both from Facebook, Google, Twitter, that's called X right now, an entire stable of tech billionaires who are now influencing policy in the US in such negative ways, influencing policy in other parts of the world also in such negative ways. And a lot of their success has been built on such monopolies. So very interesting to see how these monopoly trials will pan out.
I think the image of Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, and all of them at Trump's inauguration, I think really seals the deal on that. And these companies have also been complicit in shaping and trying to distort the narrative around the genocide in Gaza, but to no success of their own, because actually their efforts to silence and censor and shadow ban content around Palestine, around Gaza, content that mentions genocide has actually been futile, because the world really has shifted in support of the Palestinian people and demanding an end to the genocide. And nowhere is this more clear than what is now popularly referred to as the People's Arms Embargo. And this week we've seen kind of an incredible display of that in Morocco, as dock workers and citizens have been rallying at different ports and essentially trying to prevent a Maersk ship that is going to receive parts from another Maersk ship for the F-35 Lockheed Martin fighter jets, which have been, an essential cog in the machine of the Israeli genocide, dropping bombs, flying over the Gaza Strip, so these parts are it's essentially going to go through these Moroccan ports. People have been rallying. They've been, dock workers have been saying that they won't work these ships. Pretty incredible, because as we know, the only way that Israel is able to continue its horrific genocide of the Palestinian people is through US arms, is through European arms, and is through this, complex logistics network. And of course, there are vulnerabilities in this network, which is exactly what the Mask Off Maersk campaign is attempting to exploit, understanding that, at every point that these ships are able to dock, there's an opportunity for people to kind of rise up, to oppose its docking, to delay it in any way. And actually, there has been a significant delay in the delivery of these parts. The first ship, the Nexoe Maersk, was delayed for over 2 days, 49 hours, I think. The other Maersk Detroit, which is carrying the F-35 parts, is currently en route. I think there's going to be like a handoff soon. So we'll definitely be covering that story. Again, these are in times where the Netanyahus and the Donald Trumps try to present themselves as impervious to justice, as all powerful, as being able to push ahead despite mass global opposition. It's moments like these where it's very clear that the people are actually capable of pulling their weight and putting a cog in their machine. So this is a really impressive mobilization that you're seeing on the screen right now. And this week is also a really important week for mobilizing against the genocide in Gaza. There's going to be a global day of action on April 25th. People from across the world, largely in the global south, are going to be taking the streets demanding an end to the genocide, mobilizing outside US embassies, mobilizing outside European embassies, once again calling out that this genocide machine is only possible with the political, diplomatic, military, and financial support of the US and its NATO allies. And that's why we've seen these incredible mobilizations over the past 18 months in the imperial core of people saying, not only did I not vote for someone to support genocide, but I did not, consent to my tax dollars being used for genocide, and any of the ridiculous and irrestricted political support that's being given to the genocidal state of Israel right now. So, momentum is building. While it looks like, it seems like the ceasefire talks are so far off. Are they even happening? Are there any advances? But the pressure from below, the pressure from the people continues undeterred. And this persistence, the steadfastness of people on the ground to say, we will not tire and we will continue to demand an end to this atrocity is quite important and quite remarkable. And you can follow all of those stories at People's Dispatch, peoplesdispatch.org, at Morningstar, which has been covering the movement in Europe incredibly. Very important to follow People's Media because, as we said, it's not going to be Facebook, it's not going to be Instagram, any of the Meta, Google companies that are actually giving you reliable information about what's going on the ground. These companies are, again, trying to silence the truth from coming out. So it's even more important to follow independent and left media at this moment, especially with Press Freedom Day coming up. We'll be talking about that next week, I'm sure. But in that vein, another country where access to justice, freedom of press, freedom of everything is very restricted. Prasanth, what's happening in Egypt with the case of Alaa Abd el-Fattah?
Right, Zoe. Yeah, like you said, I think Egypt is 170 out of 180 countries in the World Press Freedom Index, if I'm not mistaken. Of course, that does not really convey the enormity of the problem, the kind of depravity that exists in that country as far as people who speak out against the regime are concerned, because Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, ever since coming to power, has run one of the most dictatorial regimes in the world with the full support of the United States and its other Western allies. We know that the government of Egypt would really not be able to survive for more than a week or a couple of weeks if it did not get the full-fledged support of a host of countries in the West. And now we have this government not only, of course, repressing its own citizens, but continue to help with the repression of Gaza as well, because Egypt, as we all know, has maintained a blockade on Gaza as well, along with Israel for about 15, close to 20 years now. And internally, if we look at what is happening, we know that Alaa Abd el-Fattah has been in jail since 2019, I believe. He has recently completed 50 days on hunger strike. And this happened in response to the fact that his mother, Leila Soif, who's a very prominent writer and activist, also went on hunger strike somewhere, I believe, in September, demanding the freedom of her son. And she also completed about 200 days on hunger strike. There was really no response. Important to again remember that her hunger strike was not only directed at the Egyptian authorities, but also British authorities, considering that Alaa is also British, dual citizen with British citizenship as well. Now, of course, there's been the response from the British government has been very poor. They made some general statements. They promised to raise the issue, whereas the fact is that if the British government did seriously raise the issue, there is no question that Alaa would be released tomorrow. And right now, Alaa's mother is still on a fast, but consuming only, she hasn't consumed any solid food. She's consuming only liquids. And in that context, Alaa himself went on a hunger strike to demand his freedom, to protest the current situation. His health has also declined. Once again, we know that something similar happened in 2022 when Egypt was hosting the COP summit. At that point, too, he had gone on hunger strike to raise awareness of this issue. But that again, I think it once again shows the fundamental problem right now, which is that Abdel Fattah el-Sisi has the kind of impunity that he has right now is purely because of the support that he's getting. And People's Dispatch and Morningstar both have a lot of coverage on not only Alaa's case. He's emblematic, of course. He's also important to note that technically his jail time is over. He was sentenced to 5 years in jail for supposedly what is called spreading fake news, and that he has spent 5 years in jail. But then at the very end, Egyptian authorities declared that the 2 years spent in pre-trial detention would not be counted. So again, which is highly unusual, even for dictatorial regimes. So what has happened is that he continues to be in jail. But again, a number of other similar other cases of activists remaining in jail. I think Egypt had tens of thousands of political prisoners. Right now the numbers, at one point the number was about 60,000, I believe. Right now, very unclear what those numbers are. So I think very important to keep keep highlighting cases like these, and because these are again not only cases of human rights defenders, of activists, but also connecting these cases, connecting the kind of atrocities that are being inflicted on people like Alaa with the larger global system, so to speak, or with imperialism itself, which really is what enables these kind of dictators, these kind of tyrants to continue in power. So very important to keep focusing on these cases, on the kind of efforts that people are making to make sure that he's free, and we hope that he will be able to step out, meet his son, and also meet his mother, who has also conducted such a valiant struggle for him.
Definitely a struggle that we will continue to follow. Another key, global event, which we have been continuing to follow, especially on this show, has been the war in Ukraine negotiations. A couple of weeks ago, it seemed that maybe a deal was close. Roger, what's the latest on what's happening in Ukraine?
Well, talking of US proxy nations, which we've done for the last few stories, really, the latest really is that today should have been quite a high-level summit taking place in London, and it would have included the British, the French, and the Ukrainians to talk about process towards peace. And they clearly got a call from JD Vance, who, as I understand, is in India as we speak, and were told that no, you can't have this meeting. It must be downgraded. So I think it's just now people, passers-by who happen to be French or Ukrainian and maybe from London, taking part in a cup of tea or something somewhere in London, but really nobody of any kind of consequence really is going to be part of these discussions. And essentially the US have said this: Europe, you have no role in this, and I think we've said that on this program as well before. Vance has also said that the US has put forward a plan to both Ukraine and the US. The Ukraine and Russia, which is they're claiming a peace plan. And they're saying to both parties, look, accept this or not. They need to say yes or no, and if they don't, then the US is going to consider walking away from this. Well, I mean, frankly, they've never been anywhere but in the middle of all of this. Just this week, Putin called a ceasefire over Easter, and it was very clear that the Ukrainians were using US-made weapons to break that ceasefire. So, the US is right in the middle of all of this. They're not a kind of honest kind of broker who's not involved. They're providing the weapons for Ukraine to use. Now, part of this whole thing then is, where is this going? Well, Russia's looking at this, I would have thought, and saying, well, we're making massive grounds on the battlefield, so we can wait this out, and we have made it perfectly clear what our criteria is for moving towards a ceasefire. They're not going to give up what they have won with blood on the battleground. Simply not going to happen. And the Ukrainians are saying, I think that there's a dose of reality starting to maybe seep into Zelensky's head, where he's starting to move more and more towards the idea that they may well have to give up some ground, some territory, and that seems to be where they're going. Frankly, they have no alternative, because Russia is not going to give those lands up. They've made that perfectly clear. So whether or not this latest proposal takes us any further forward is anyone's guess, really. But if you're sitting there in Moscow, you're thinking, well, we've made lots of ground. We're in the number one seat. Zelensky, what are you going to do? Are you going to stop firing into Russia? Are you going to treat this whole thing seriously? And of course, for Zelensky, this is a matter of survival as well. There's plenty of evidence that seems to suggest that the US is really kind of just about to boot him over, boot him off the table, get rid of him. And if he goes, then that's really the end of him in more ways than one, I think. So it's going to be an interesting period to see where these proposals get to. If I was a betting man, which usually I'm not, but I would say that we're going to move towards some sort of another truce at some coming up. Whether that leads to anything more than that, I don't know. I think a concern is always whether or not this is a genuine peace plan that isn't really about just giving more space for the Ukrainians to rearm again. And I think that's a real concern that Russia has. So watch this space. Obviously, give the people what they want. We'll continue to cover this story. We'll look to do what we can to give voice to the peace campaigns that are still taking place, that are still marching on the streets, that are still trying to call for peace in Ukraine and elsewhere.
Well, one very important advocate for peace was, of course, Pope Francis, who passed away on Monday. In fact, in his last public address, he made a quite strong call for peace, not only just generally in the world, but specifically in Gaza, calling for a ceasefire. And the loss of Pope Francis has really been felt across the world. He was, again, not only an advocate for peace, which, you know, in a broad general way, that's generally what, you know, you would hope. But he was someone who was sharp in calling out the social inequalities and their root, pointing out the ills that were created by the capitalist system, calling for an end, of course, to poverty, to hunger. But he was someone who said that every family should have a house, every farmer should have land, really believing in the access to these basic social rights that today, you know, when we're saying, you know, of course, it's kind of ridiculous that saying that, you know, of course, all people are for peace, but in today's world, it's really not something that is that can be taken for granted. And the idea and the concept that every single person, you know, merits and should have dignity and dignified conditions to live in is also not something that is definitely, you know, confirmed by today's current leaders. So he was one of these kind of important voices on the global stage and intervened in really key moments, not only, you know, speaking to world leaders, calling for the ceasefire, calling for an end to poverty, calling for dignified treatment of migrants, especially calling out, of course, the graveyard of the Mediterranean and all of the challenges and the suffering that migrants face migrating to the United States. But also he was someone who was trying to engage directly with social movements and many movements that we're familiar with, the Landless Rural Workers Movement of Brazil, the Council of Indigenous and Popular Organizations of Honduras, COPIN, many other movements from across Latin America, especially from his home country of Argentina, were actually engaged in a process that was a direct meeting and dialogue with the Pope and, you know, his circle in the Vatican, trying to come up with solutions together to, again, address these problems. And it is definitely something that's worth noting because, of course, there's many interventions that he did within Catholicism, within the church. You know, as someone who's not Catholic and not very familiar with the church, I think these, you know, it's of course relevant. And I think pushing the Catholic Church in a more progressive direction is always good. But someone who's on the global stage, who has the respect and the command of leaders on a, you know, of course, national leaders on a global level again, but also engaging with movements, I think is something that is really unique. And for example, there was a meeting that was held in 2015 in Bolivia, in Cochabamba, in the mountainous region in Bolivia, meeting with leaders, you know, giving them strength, giving them his perspective on the crisis of capitalism. This is something that's very unique. And again, I'm not someone who follows the proceedings of the Catholic Church, despite all of us having seen Conclave this year. It's unlikely that we'll get someone who was as linked and as sensitive with the people, someone who knew about the mothers of Plaza de Mayo, despite himself having a sort of criticized role during the military dictatorship. He was someone who lifted up the demands of the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo for justice, who worked with the recyclers and the cardboard collectors in the streets of Buenos Aires, gave mass to them, stood side by side with them and said, you deserve a dignified life. This is someone who has a very sensitive, humanist perspective that was a very crucial light, that FaceTimed every single night with priests in Gaza. It's, these are people that bring a certain humanism to the global stage that we're not seeing right now. And so it's definitely a loss. We've seen movements across Latin America, again, mourning his loss, people in Palestine mourning his loss. And, they say that the conclave is now beginning. So we'll see, kind of what is the next option for the Catholic Church. A church with, of course, very complicated, to say the least, roots in its role in colonization process, its role in a lot of atrocities across the world. But again, its leader for a couple of years was someone who did bring this idea and the concept of humanity back to the fore. So he will be missed, and we'll see what happens next for that. But continue to follow, again, People's Dispatch. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Follow Morning Star. We're not going to just be following the Pope. We're going to be following the movements that he engaged with. We're going to be following the events and the global events that he was talking about. So stay tuned. Follow People's Dispatch. Follow Morning Star, and we'll be back next week.